Hey everybody, Questwise here. Today is the part one of an 8-part series called The Road to Palladium Open House. That's right, your very own Questwise will be coming to the Palladium Open House in April. And so we're going to be doing a series of 8 videos called The Lore of the Megaverse, and in which I'm going to talk about everything from Palladium Fantasy to Rifts and a bunch of other Palladium games as well too. And at the end of this video, stay tuned because I will be giving out a clue. I will be giving out part of a phrase that if you watch all 8 videos will make sense if you collect all the phrases together into one big sentence. And if you can do so, I will talk about the eligibility of winning something pretty cool at the end of this 8 video series. So stay tuned for that. Today we're going to be talking about the Palladium fantasy role-playing game in our Lore of the Megaverse. And when I say lore, what I mean by that is the dictionary definition of the term lore, which is a body of traditions and knowledge of a subject typically passed from person to person by word of mouth, which I think fits role-playing games pretty accurately. I think that fits that very, very well. But today we're going to be talking about Palladium Fantasy and the lore behind Palladium Fantasy and the history of the world and a little bit about all the cool stuff that you can find about this game. First off, we're going to talk about the history of the in-game world itself. And that can be broken down into about 6 parts, 6 eras or ages, as they sometimes call them in the book itself. The first one is called the Age of Chaos. This is when the old ones, which can be, kind of attributed to the same, as akin to the old ones from H.P. Lovecraft's writings. But this is an age when it's believed that the old ones reigned over the earth, that they were in control of the planet itself and sort of shaped the face of the planet and the natural aspects of the planet itself. They dominated over all life. They created all things. They created magic. They created the races. They created the world itself, if the lore is to be believed. There's a lot of gray area when it comes to the Age of Chaos because it was such a long time ago that a lot of scholars, in-game scholars, believe that a lot of this is sort of myth and that it never really took place, or it took place in a different manner and unfolded differently than what is currently recorded. One of the big things about Palladium Fantasy and any of the Palladium games, or most of the Palladium games, are ley lines. And ley lines, if you don't know, are these magical bands of energy that encircle the planet. And when they meet up at a nexus point, when these lines sort of intersect across the planet, or any of the planets, any of the Palladium worlds, this create a nexus point, or the title to the game itself, Rifts, in which they sort of portals will open and things, the veil between worlds are open and things can pass back and forth between them. And we'll get a lot more into ley lines when we talk about Rifts Earth itself. But it's believed that during this time period in the Palladium fantasy world, during the Age of Chaos, that the ley lines were 10 times more powerful than they are in the current setting of the world itself. And I just wanted to note that because ley lines will become much more important in another video series when we talk about the more lore about the worlds. The next age would be the Age of Light. The Age of Light lasted it's believed, between 30,000 to 60,000 years. This is when most of the races that we know of in the current Palladium world began to exist. They came into existence and began to show their face upon the Palladium fantasy world. The ley lines were approximately 10 to 50 times more powerful than they are in the current fantasy world. And that age lasted for such a long time that it allowed races to sort of develop their own sort of independent identities and tribes and cities, and that began to take the foothold for the different types of races. That's one of the great things about Palladium Fantasy, is that in a typical fantasy game, you're given maybe 4 to 5 choices, maybe 6. Palladium Fantasy has a plethora of different races you can choose from. The typical ones like humans, elves, dwarves, gnomes, that kind of stuff, but also really inclusive ones like playing a goblin or an orc or a changeling or a troll or a minotaur. All those things are available to play, and I think it makes the Palladium Fantasy world very, very diverse one. And we'll talk about more about that kind of stuff in the Rifts video as well too, about DBs or dimensional beings coming from other parts of the Megaverse. I guess I should at this point explain what the Megaverse is. So Palladium has created this idea that all worlds and different time periods are all interconnected together in one giant megaverse. Think of the word universe and multiplying that by all the different worlds out there. Be they alien worlds or different time periods, be it traditional, like modern day Earth, to Rift's Earth in the far future, to Palladium Fantasy. All these things are interconnected in the Megaverse, and they sometimes cross over because of these rifts or these nexuses of the ley lines. That's why they're so important. The next era is the Battle of the Gods. A lot of scholars believe that this era never happened, that this wasn't a fake thing. But what's interesting to note is that there's sort of like Garden of Eden aspect that happens during this era, during the Battle of the Gods, in which which humanity actually was sort of birthed and rose to quite a bit of dominance inside the Yin Sloth jungles before they were sort of corrupted, when it was a sort of beautiful land full of bounty and full of everything that a race would need. And they rose to quite some prominence, a very, very powerful civilization, and were put down when the dark gods sort of attacked, and there was this huge battle, and the humanity was thrown out of the jungle itself, and the jungle became what it is known today, as full of monsters and twisted vines and crushed ruins of this ancient civilizations. I know that later in the fluff and the history of the Palladium Fantasy world, that it talks the humans were just simply knocked down into sort of a barbaric state again, and they had to rise to dominance later again. I like to believe, and sometimes I like to run this in my games, but I like to think that first group of humans that rose up to dominance in the Yinsloth jungles were actually the Atlanteans that we'll run into in the Rifts world itself. But let's just keep that on the back burner. The next age was called the Age of 1,000 Magics, when magic was dominant and all these different sorts of forms of magic rose up and were used by the different races. Scholars don't believe that there were actually 1,000 different types of magic, that maybe a few hundred or maybe even just a couple dozen. But this is an age when magic was very, very dominant. And in a lot of other fantasy worlds, this is a prominent thing too, that magic was sort of abused and overused, and it came to such prominence that that it became dangerous, it became deadly, and it actually caused more problems than it actually did good. So the Age of Magic happened about 2,000 to 10,000 years before the elves actually took dominance over the world. And the ley lines, the power of them was probably equal to about what Rift's Earth is at the time that the Rift's Earth actually takes place. Next is the Age of Elves. This is when the elves rose to prominence. And this is what's kind of interesting about the way that the Palladium Fantasy world works, is that while you can trace a lot of like similarities between this and the Tolkien-esque idea of fantasy, and that's kind of the starting standard when it comes to fantasy, is that everybody kind of looks to Tolkien as being that sort of like the seed, the point where those things diverge from. And it's interesting to note that the elves in this became dominant later, where in the Tolkien type of idea, the elves were the first race, that they were the firstborn, that they were the ones that took prominence first. And in this game, the elves didn't actually take full prominence until about the Fifth Age, which is kind of interesting. The humanity had actually risen up before them and had fallen before they actually took full dominance of the world and powered over it. Age of the Elves lasted for about 10,000 years. Ley lines began to drift in power to about 10 to 20% less than what they are in Earth today. And it was during this time that the Elf-Dwarf War happened, and the loss of life was astronomical. That was the downfall of the prominence of the elves. The last and the current timeline that falls into this is the time of man, and that's where we currently fall into the game when you pick up the book itself. We're in the age of man, and then within the last about 300 years or so, man has begun to spread and show his dominance over the entire fantasy world at this point. Ley lines are 60% less powerful, but they're still prominent. They're still important because ley lines fuel magic, and anytime that magic and psionics are used near ley line or near a nexus, they are enhanced and increased as well. Some real world stats about Palladium Fantasy itself. Well, the game itself was first published in 1983. Second edition came out in 1996 and is still in print today. Still chugging along. Still one of my all-time favorite fantasy games. I can't say enough great things about Palladium Fantasy, and if you haven't checked it out yourself, you really should do yourself a favor and check it out. It was voted in the top 25 most popular RPGs. That was a reader's poll in Arcane magazine, which unfortunately is not in print anymore. But nice to know that it was, and at least in my opinion, still in the top 25 best RPGs of all time. It's been a while since I've done an update to Palladium Fantasy. I know that there's a lot of things in works for this, but what's great about this game is it still holds up today. Even having been published in the second edition, this edition coming out in 1996, it's still a kick-ass game and still holds up really, really well. So that's going to be it for today. That's the lore of the Palladium Fantasy universe, or Palladium Fantasy world itself. But at the beginning of this video, I talked about a sort of contest. I don't really know if I call it a contest. But a little bit of an incentive for you, the watchers and the fans of Palladium books, to be a part of the channel and to get a little incentive or something. So here's what I'm going to do. I have a secret phrase that I've collected from one of the Palladium books, any of the games, and I'm going to give it to you piecemeal. I'm going to give it to you shortly in phrases. So after all 8 videos, you'll be able to piece these all together. So you might want to write these down. It's going to be over a period of time. But if at the end of those 8 videos, you're able to piece those all together into one coherent sentence, and you're able to tell me what the phrase refers to, if you're coming to the Palladium open house in April, I will give you a special magic item. If you play in my game, which is going to be entitled The Long Cold Night, if you're able to give me the phrase and what it is attributed to, I will give you an in-game magical item that you'll be able to use in my one-shot called The Long Cold Night. If you're unable to make it to Palladium open house in April, which I completely understand, it's not feasible for everyone, and there are fans all over the world, if you can give me the phrase via a message on my last video of this 8-piece series, give me the complete phrase and what it refers to, you'll win a free Palladium Books t-shirt. All right? So, today, the part of the phrase is, and as elf. And as elf. That's the very first part of the 8-part phrase, and it is, once again, and as elf. As always, thank you everybody for watching. I appreciate your support in all things, and until next time, I'm Questwise, and I'm out.